So France has built a global reputation and made history for various reasons. Today, I wondered if any plants are part of this history. Well, I found a few of them, and it's their story that I'm going to tell you today. So I think that if you talk about France to any foreigner, there are quite a few things that will come to their mind, rarely plants, for starters. First, Paris and its famous buildings, the Eiffel Tower above all, and then the Arc de Triomphe, the Champs-Élysées, which apparently is the most famous avenue in the world. And then Notre Dame, Montmartre, and all those things that make Paris the ultimate romantic city, Paris, the city of love. And speaking of love, there's something French that's recognized worldwide. It's this. And yes, we're known for the galoche, better known as the French kiss. Well, for now we're far from plants, but we'll get there. But as long as we're in Paris, let's go down a bit into the depths of Paris, because under Paris you can find things that grow, or at least that have grown. And here we have the famous Paris mushroom. So first of all, this famous Paris mushroom is no longer produced in Paris. In fact, France isn't even the biggest producer of Paris mushrooms, and besides the French, there aren't many people in the world today who call it the Paris mushroom. And above all, it's not a plant, because if we go down that road, we also have the black truffle from Périgord, which is apparently one of the best truffles in the world, but still, it's not a plant. All right, next topic. Another thing that comes up often is the history of France, certain events, the French Revolution, which is studied a lot in other parts of the world. And then we also have some famous figures like Napoleon Bonaparte, King Louis XIV, who apparently is one of the most famous kings in the world. I'm not great at history, so these facts should be checked. Anyway, we're looking for plants. That being said, if we dig a little into these topics, we'll still be able to find a plant, even two that are very closely linked to the history of France and especially to the history of royalty. Since the time of King Charles the Bald, Charlemagne's grandson, so around the 800s, which is quite a while ago, there's a flower that's internationally recognized as being linked to French royalty, and that's the Fleur-de-Lis. Several legends explain why this flower was chosen. The first is linked to King Clovis, so we're talking about the 400s, which goes back even further, who supposedly took this flower as a symbol after the Battle of Vouillé, which he won against, I can't remember who, I'll put the info in the subtitles maybe. And this Battle of Vouillé took place near a river, and on the banks of that river, irises were growing. And apparently, due to a mistranslation, iris was turned into lily. And by the way, if you look at the symbol of the Fleur-de-Lis, it actually looks a little more like an iris than a lily. Then, as I told you, there are several legends around this story, and maybe the lily was chosen for more Catholic, more religious reasons, because the white lily is associated with the Virgin Mary. So I don't know which story is true, but in any case, what is certain is that today when we see this symbol, we call it the Fleur-de-Lis. So botanically, these aren't necessarily plants that are only associated with France. Lilies and irises can be found pretty much everywhere. There are two that are specifically linked to France, the Pyrenean lily and the Pyrenean iris. So in the Pyrenees, you'll find these two flowers, and they're almost endemic to France. They're found almost only in France, maybe along the Pyrenean border or the Swiss border, but mostly in France. That's it for the first two plants. Let's continue. When discussing France, French gastronomy quickly comes up as we're internationally recognized for it. And in gastronomy, we'll find quite a few plants connected to the history of France, and we'll also find many plants that aren't originally from France at all, but are culturally very closely linked to France. And the neighbor mowing the lawn. Oh, that's going to be annoying, huh? All right, let's talk about French gastronomy then, hoping that the neighbor's lawnmower won't be too much of a bother. And when we talk about gastronomy, of course, we're going to talk about cheese. So first, Roquefort, Camembert. So here, we're not really talking about plants. Even though I know a plant that smells like Camembert, it's not at all a typically French plant. Let's move on. We have some French dishes that are internationally recognized, like burgundy snails, foie gras, frog legs, but we're looking for plants, so let's keep going. We'll discuss vegetables soon, but first, let's cover some world-renowned plants. I'm going to list the plants for you, but actually it's mostly groups of plants that are well known, you'll see. In the first group, we'll have thyme, bay leaf, and parsley, very often accompanied by chives, celery, tarragon, and leek greens. And in the second group, we'll have thyme again, accompanied by rosemary, savory, oregano, and marjoram. So do you see which groups I'm talking about? The first group is the famous bouquet garni, which accompanies some famous recipes like pot-au-feu, blanquette, beef bourguignon, or coq au vin. And the second group is the famous herbes de Provence, which give a typically Provençal touch to many dishes, like Provençal-style tomatoes. Without the herbs, they're just cooked tomatoes. Another classic French dish wouldn't be as charming without herbes de Provence. That's when we start discussing vegetables. And there are certain vegetables, four in particular, that if you put them together, create a typically French image. You'll see cooked zucchini, eggplant, tomato, and bell pepper together. Add some herbe de Provence, and you get the famous ratatouille, which is clearly world-renowned. But of course, we agree that these are not French plants at all. Eggplant comes from Asia, zucchini comes from Central America, tomato and bell pepper come from South America. It's more of a cultural connection to France than a botanical one. These aren't the only foreign plants imported and now internationally recognized as truly associated with France. For example, we have the potato, which is one of the most used vegetables in recipes that are, as a result, called French style. In many foreign countries, you can order à la carte dishes like salade niçoise, gratin dauphinois, pomme dauphine, pomme de terre Anna, or pomme pont-neuf, which are thick French fries. And so, that brings us to fries, which in some foreign countries are called French fries. Because everyone knows very well that fries are of French or Belgian origin. I don't want to start the debate, since maybe they're not Belgian or French, maybe they're Spanish, as potatoes first came to Europe through Spain, where they cooked them often. They might have already made fries there. That being said, let's say the best ones are the Belgian ones. I mean the best fries. Share your thoughts in the comments, but be kind, no fighting over fries. Because there are other vegetables that are called French, beans for example, French bean in English means green beans. So it's not a French vegetable at all and it's cooked everywhere else. On the other hand, cooking them very young when they don't have any strings, those really crunchy green beans, well, apparently that's a French specialty. We also have shallots. So that's kind of the French touch in cooking. If you make a dish where you add shallots, well, it has a bit of a French touch. It's actually the base of one of the most famous sauces in the world, béarnaise sauce, which is typically French. Even though originally shallots come from Central Asia, they were selected and improved in the Middle East. But today, in cooking, it's French. Leeks are another vegetable commonly linked to France. So, because of different dishes, for example, vichyssoise soup, a cold soup with a mix of leeks and potatoes, which was created in the United States, but by a French chef. And the leek is also used in pot-au-feu and is also the base of many broths and stocks in French-style cooking. So in this case, the leek is almost of French origin because the perpetual leek, the ancestor of the leek, comes from the Mediterranean coasts. It was likely domesticated in Egypt, so we're still not in France, but getting closer. Next we have a legume. We have the lentil and the famous green lentil from Le Puy, which is very well known in many countries as one of the best. And by the way, in some foreign restaurants, on the menu, you'll often see green lentil from Le Puy specified to highlight its superior quality. And botanically, the lentil actually originates from Western Asia and the Near East, not very, very far from us. Then we also have the artichoke, which is quite well known. The artichoke comes from Brittany. Apparently, artichokes have lost popularity in recent years. Let me know in the comments, what's your relationship with artichokes? Apparently, in France today, 2 out of 3 French people never eat artichokes, and 70% of those who do are over 60 years old. So let me know in the comments, do you eat artichokes? And tell me how old you are if you don't mind. Well, I could also talk to you about certain types of carrots, like the Nantes carrot, which is apparently quite well known abroad as being French. And then, when you mention carrots, you also think of peas. Why not? And in some countries, you can find what's called French-style peas, cooked with bacon and onions. And maybe that onion will be a Roscoff onion. We're still in Brittany. Onion, which is also a staple of French cuisine, especially thanks to the famous onion soup that was supposedly invented in Paris in the 18th century. As I mentioned, France is a nation of food lovers, so we could likely find a French story for nearly every vegetable. That being said, I'll still finish with one last vegetable that really has a French story and is botanically almost entirely of French origin. It's the endive, which may be the most French of all French specialties. The ancestor of endive, wild chicory, grew in almost all of Western Europe, so it's not uniquely French, but it was still found a lot in France. On the other hand, the domestication, the selection of varieties, and especially the technique for growing endive were supposedly developed by accident in 1630 in Montreuil-sous-Bois. So here, we're in France. On top of that, France is the world's leading producer of endive. Almost all of it is produced in the Hauts-de-France region. As a result, endive is found in quite a few specialties in typically French recipes like endive with ham, endive salads, and so on. So, with endive, I think we've found our most typically French vegetable. We've found it. Come on, that's something to celebrate. Champagne. And because in France, we're good eaters, well, apparently we're also good drinkers. So I think on that front, we'll be able to find quite a few plants. And so, obviously, right at the top of the list is the grapevine. Now, like with the others, here we're not talking about a plant that's botanically typically French, The ancestor of our French grape varieties, so Vitis vinifera, is largely of Eurasian origin, Europe, the Middle East, Asia. This wild grapevine was domesticated over 10,000 years ago in various regions of the Caucasus and Middle East, and then it was spread, selected, and improved in other regions like Egypt, Crete, and Italy, and in France about 2,500 years ago. So Vitis vinifera is one species among others. There are other species, for example, American species that were brought to France later to save the French grape varieties. French grape varieties nearly vanished due to diseases like phylloxera and downy mildew. Fortunately, we use resistant American grape varieties as rootstocks for our French varieties. And thanks to that, we saved our vineyards. That's not the point, so we'll skip that story. So, France has an international reputation when it comes to wine. We're not the only country that makes wine, obviously, but still we have a lot of wines with a great reputation. We have the wines from Bordeaux, Burgundy, Alsace, and of course, Champagne. We also have excellent wines from Gaillac. Speaking of alcohol, let's discuss another plant deeply tied to French history. A green plant, a bit magical. Some of you already know what I'm talking about. A plant that's emblematic of certain French personalities. Leading the list, possibly Henri Toulouse-Lautrec, as well as Paul Verlaine, Arthur Rimbaud, Charles Baudelaire, or Edouard Manet. We could also mention Van Gogh, Ernest Hemingway, Oscar Wilde, who aren't French but who came to Paris with their dreams of being artists and along the way took the opportunity to consume huge amounts of absinthe. And yes, it's the famous Green Fairy. It's the late 19th and early 20th century, and Paris enjoys a worldwide reputation as a major hub for artists of all kinds. At that time in Paris, there were a lot of cafes and very famous cabarets. These are the places where many artists like to gather. And at that time, the iconic drink in these places was absinthe. The drink was supposedly created in Switzerland, but then it was a Frenchman, Henri-Louis Pernod, who industrialized the production method and became the world's leading producer of absinthe. It was a huge success until it was banned in 1915. So, there were different years when it was banned, but in France it was 1915. Absinthe was banned. Production resumed somewhat in the 2000s. It's allowed again, but as a result, the drink no longer has the same popularity it had back then. So let me know in the comments, have you ever seen absinthe and what do you think about it? And I would have liked to tell you about another plant, gentian, which is also strongly linked to France. We've discussed alcohol enough for today, so let's switch topics. Now we'll look at two plants that, while not exclusively French, are closely tied to its history. And then we'll finish with the plant that, in my opinion, is the most French of all. So the first plant is the oak. There are lots of species, and in this case, we're definitely not the country with the most of them. Except maybe for two species, the pedunculate oak and the sessile oak, where in this case, France is the country with the most of them, but still, we're not the country with the most oaks overall. On the other hand, I think we are the country that has integrated it the most into our history, and that goes back to ancient times. The oak is the tree of the Druids, which is the sacred tree par excellence. Alongside that, we've been using it for a very long time in many types of construction, obviously in timber framing, but also in fine woodworking, furniture, royal furniture in the Louis XIV and Louis XV styles. There are a lot of oak pieces of furniture. We also use it a lot in shipbuilding, for constructing boats, for railways, the railroad ties. They're made of oak. In short, oak usually comes first for quality. I said we wouldn't discuss alcohol, but let's briefly mention it anyway. Oak is also the wood used to make barrels to store and age wine and cognac, and many of them are also exported to Scotland for whiskey. And to come back to its symbolic side, oak is the tree of resistance, durability, and strength. You will find crowns of oak leaves on the cross of the Legion of Honor. And then on coins, on some 1 and 2 euro coins, you will find olive leaves and oak leaves on the back. The olive tree is not specifically linked to France. I'm not going to discuss it yet, but some coins have oak leaves on the back. Now let's finish with the two most French plants and get on the podium. We'll start with the second spot on the podium, the rose. Even though there are some pretty good English rose bushes, the French rose bush is apparently still the most famous of all, and in particular the old rose bush, which is also called the French rose bush. And in Latin, it's Rosa gallica. So France has a long history with roses and rose bushes, and the most famous and best-selling ones in the world are French rose bushes. The Mélande rose bush, the Pierre de Ronsard rose, and then the Bonica rose bush. After that, I'm not a great expert on roses and rose bushes. They're not plants I've grown a lot, but I'm interested in them. So if there are any of you who know about this, contact me, let me know, tell me your stories about roses, I'm interested. And so we'll finish with the most French plant of all, which is lavender. Lavender is truly the quintessential French plant. Visually, you'll already find it in a lot of famous paintings. Van Gogh, and also for its therapeutic qualities. First of all, lavender, and especially lavender essential oil, is known and used all over the world, and above all, it's recognized as a typically French plant, since it's in Provence that the best lavender is produced, or at least the most interesting one for essential oil. And the essential oil, which has many uses. It's relaxing, it's great for relieving stress, it's very useful for treating skin burns, it's added to cleaning products for its antiseptic properties or for its scent. Simply, and as a result, it's also used extensively in perfumery, and you'll find lavender in the composition of many perfumes by Yves Saint Laurent, Jean-Paul Gaultier, Dior, Chanel, and many great perfumers. You'll often find lavender. Alright, I'm at the end. I could have gone into detail about many more plants. I don't even know how many plants I mentioned in this video, but I think it's quite a few. Originally, I wanted to talk about the 5 French plants, and I think I went over 5. I hope you enjoyed it. Tell me what you think about all this in the comments, and thank you for sticking with me until now. If you liked it, please give a thumbs up and share. It's always appreciated. Subscribe to the channel and all that, it's really appreciated. And if you want to support me financially, there are links over there in the description at the end of the video to my Typee page. A big thank you to everyone who does it, who will do it, without whom I wouldn't be able to keep taking time to make videos. Alright, thank you all and see you very soon for more videos. Bye. Bye.